Tanzanito Temtek. My name is Cathy Richardson, Nyirinkwaya, and welcome to this conversation. And today I'm here with David Denborough, and I am on Vancouver Island on the unceded Coast Salish territories of the Qualicum and Snanoose people. And this is also the area where I grew up as a child. And as a Métis person, I'm grateful that I was able to have my formative years on this beautiful Coast Salish land. So I met David in 1999 at a family therapy conference in Oslo, Norway. And it was a pretty exciting time for therapeutic ideas, family therapy, evolving reflecting teams and things like that. And so we're going to have a conversation about some of that history and evolution and some of the parallel kinds of work we've been doing across continents, right, David?
That would be wonderful, Cathy. It's just great to be with you.
Yes. And so do you want to go ahead and just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about, where you are right now.
Sure. So I'm here on beautiful Ghana land, territory of the Ghana people. It's in the continent now known as Australia, and it's in the southern part. And it's the Adelaide Plains is what's referred to as the Ghana people's lands, and also very beautiful seas. And I'm actually right next to the sea here. I had a dip this morning, so that was pretty beautiful. And in talking about the Ghana people, I just would like to mention Auntie Barbara Wingard. Of course, you knew Cathy, who's a senior Ghana elder who's now passed away, but she was extremely influential in relation to the field of narrative therapy and community work here and in my own life. So just want to mention her. And yeah, Cathy, it's just lovely to be online with you, having seen you not that long ago, actually, in Montreal, but now we're in two very different places. And yes, thinking way back to Oslo, there've been, yes, many different stories to share. I'll be guided by you as to which ones we might begin with, but it's a real delight to be with you. And I looked at your Substack just this morning, and the diversity of the conversations and chats you've been having just seem exquisite to me. So I'm looking forward to hearing a bit about your current thinking too.
Yeah. Well, I remember Auntie Barbara and how she also called you her adopted son, didn't she? Or was it grandson? I remember she was very close.
She did indeed. It's every one of these stories is a long story, but one of the first sort of very significant experiences when I was working at Dulwich Centre is that Cheryl White thought it would be a very good idea for there to be a book by Auntie Barbara Wingard and Jane Lester, because there were no books by First Nations practitioners at that time in Australia. And so Cheryl had this great idea of knowing Auntie Barb and the great work she was doing, and knowing Jane Lester and the great work she was doing, that there needed to be a book. So my job was, what a delightful job, was to get to sit with Auntie Barb by the River Murray and hear the different sorts of stories she'd like to share with others, and record those, and then write them up and draft them and bring them back to Auntie Barb and do that. And the same with Jane. And they were, yeah, the starts of what were very significant relationships for me. Auntie Barb welcoming me into family as part of those processes, and Jane inviting me to think about my family and family histories in ways that changed my life. But yes, Auntie Barb was a very dear second mother to me. And I know you're there with your mother at the moment on Vancouver Island. And I met your children when they were very young, and you met my other parents. There are all sorts of, speaking of family therapy, there are all sorts of ways that our families are intertwined too. So yeah, you're one of the few people in the field who knew my biological parents, and also knew Auntie Barb, my other mother, who welcomed me into family in profound ways.
Mm-hmm. And when I think back on some of the writing, maybe particularly when I think of Jane, I remember the movement up to Sorry Day in Australia and reading about how a plane went by and with its exhaust wrote something like sorry or we're sorry in the sky. And then I believe it was Jane and writing about her response to that. And I just felt really teary. We hadn't had our truth and reconciliation process in Canada, and we hadn't had that kind of national recognition of the harms that had been done, and just how it felt for people to have that acknowledged. It was pretty big for me. I remember that writing. Yeah.
Well, it was in a context here of Australia of the national government refusing to apologise. There'd been grassroots campaigns for an apology that had been met with coldness and such a lack of grace by the political leadership.
Mhm.
And at that time, there was really a grassroots campaign organising by many, many different Australians who were just, wanted to offer something different to respond to what was such a generous invitation and request for acknowledgement. And so there were these marches, and yeah, that someone had the idea, someone I know had the idea to use a plane to draw sorry in the sky, and it was a significant moment here. Yeah, so I've appreciated your travels down under, Cathy. I read, you're both a traveller and a homebody.
Yes.
And yes, whether it's Oslo or down under, I remember we also met in Atlanta, didn't we? You were at that event too, where Jane and Auntie Barb were also present.
Oh yeah, you're right. There's so much to talk about. We've intersected in a number of different places around the globe. But to start with you, in a way, if I can kind of summarize how I've known your work, you've been a writer, an author. You've also been a scribe for many narrative therapy writings, and that was your former email, wasn't it? Writings at Dulwich.
Yes, it was indeed.
I remember that, and there seems to have been I don't know if it's just two paths, but two tracks where Dulwich and your work has taken up a lot of community practices as well as an evolving kind of narrative therapy. Do you want to talk a little bit about that journey and what that was like for you?
Sure, it's a lovely question. I really love that work and still do, because for the field of narrative practice to have contemporary resonance and to be part of the project that I think it's always been, it has to keep expanding or being written by and authored by folks in many different social locations. And that's where the challenges come, it's where the stretches come, and it always has been. And finding ways to elevate those different perspectives is a joy, actually, but it's also just a source of great learning and challenge. So in those early days, again, it was Cheryl who was like, as a publisher, or as trying to be someone working in like a community of ideas, you can't just wait for people to write their work, or basically you end up with white men's writings, white cisgender men's writings being the only published voices in the field. So who would want to be just in that field? So being asked and supported to, yes, be a scribe, just often it's starting in the spoken word, having conversations. Then in those days, the written word was still the key media. These days, of course, there's podcasts, there's Substacks, there's videos, and there are many, many different ways to do this. So now, quite a bit of my work is behind the scenes curating free online courses so that these can, ideas can be much more widely available. But for me, like sitting with Auntie Barb, sitting with Jane, being trusted with their stories, and then learning from that and where the relationships then take you, because then other invitations come, other partnerships can evolve, and I really treasure that that area of work and independent publishing and all the sorts of things that you're doing and elevating other people's voices. It's something I treasure.
Yeah. And in the early days, I remember reading your book. It was called Beyond the Prison. And there was something in there about becoming squarehead and becoming gooba. And I love that. I thought it was so fun. So I think it was like your entry into the world of social work, into a very sort of rigid institution and trying to find your way. Do you want to share a few memories about that piece and that time in your life?
Sure. Well, that really came about because how Auntie Barb and Tim Aegis, another key First Nations man here, first became linked with Dulwich Centre is that they were trying to respond to Aboriginal deaths in custody, which I'm sure everybody listening to this would know is a huge issue and a contemporary issue of profound colonial injustice in this land. And there'd been a Royal Commission, but there'd been no response to the families. So and Tim was trying to think, someone's got to reach out to the families in South Australia who'd experienced a death in custody. So that led to a project, and they approached Michael White and Gerald White to say, could they collaborate? This was the first key partnership really for Dulwich Centre, the Aboriginal Health Council and Dulwich Centre. So from that came this gathering, and that was Tim's idea. So it was an Aboriginal invention to have a community gathering, but shaped by narrative ideas, because Tim had known of Michael's work and really liked it. So they crafted, Tim leading what sort of protocols would be needed for consultation to work out what was going to be talked about. Auntie Barb was one of the key workers in the listening teams. They didn't call them reflecting teams, they called them listening teams. And all the families came together at this place called Camp Coorong and experienced this gathering, which was then called Reclaiming Our Stories, Reclaiming Our Lives. More than aware of. Anyway, out of that, Cheryl had taken great care with the finances, like saved every cent, and there was some money left over. And she tried to give it back. She said, this is like very precious funds that have come from this project. And Tim said, it doesn't really work that way. Like, once there's a grant, there's the money, and we can't really give it back. What about doing something more broadly questioning prisons? Because prisons are not only affecting First Nations people here, they're also devastating the lives of other folks in prisons, other poor, marginalised Australians overrepresented in prisons. So it was that invitation that then led to me being asked to try and put something together about, Beyond the Prison, gathering dreams of freedom.
Right. Okay.
And it was because I've been working in a maximum security prison and trying to find ways of responding to and preventing men's violence. That's actually the social issue that really brought me in contact with this field.
Okay.
And so, that was quite, I was off searching for and trying to find pathways beyond the prison. And actually just one of the free online courses working on now is to update that and all the different abolitionist narrative practice things that have happened since then. Sorry, rather a long answer, but in terms of the becoming gubba, becoming squarehead, no one's asked me about that for a long time, Cathy. And that was because there I was, this white middle class, at that time quite young, I was probably 23 in the prison. And the men there were so wanting to offer something back to their communities. They were doing long sentences, and they would talk to me about, when we get out, we just want to try and do something for the young men in our communities and offer anything we can. And they asked me if I'd try and create a pathway for that. So we had to create a course that would be resonant and relevant for them, and might also be a formal qualification to assist them in doing welfare work back in their communities. Some of the best experiences of my working life happened in those conversations, but including when they let me know that I was a squarehead. And I don't know if you have that. Do you have that term in your part of the world?
No, we don't. No.
Well, I hadn't heard it either, but I realised it was a relatively common term about middle-class people from working-class folks. But because I'd lived in a middle-class bubble, I didn't know that's who I was. So it was a process of realising, okay, I'm a squarehead. What does that mean to see this world through middle-class eyes? And Gubba was the First Nations word that Koori folks were using in New South Wales to describe whitefellas, so that I was a Gubba. And I didn't know I was a Gubba either. So it was like, okay, I am these things. I just didn't realize. How can I think about my life in those ways, and how could that make more partnerships possible to be working together on these realms? So yeah, no, thanks for asking me about this. Bringing to mind all those folks in that room in the education department at Long Bay Prison, where they were giving me an education. They were educating me about who I really was in this land.
An invitation to explore your multiple identities. And you mentioned about how important it is to document the stories of our ancestors and the historical experiences. And so you decided to do that with a more recent book about unsettling Australia. Forgive me if I don't have the full title, you can offer it, but you wrote a letter to probably your great grandpa, something like that, and asked him what the hell was he thinking? Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. Well, that story leads back to Jane Lester, who I mentioned at the beginning. So way back in that first project with Jane and Auntie Barb welcomed me to family, and it took me a long time to realise the sort of Aboriginal philosophy that represented. I think initially it was probably because if she was working with this young white guy, different generation, and we were having these intimate stories, well, it couldn't happen except in relationship in some way. So I actually think probably at the beginning, I was becoming family in a protocol relationship way. It wasn't, that I was special or anything. This was, and over time, we definitely became family. With Jane, a really different, again, it took me a long time to realize, different politic and different Aboriginal philosophy, because she said to me, and I remember this very distinctly over a cup of tea in her home, working on her stories. She was telling all these stories of reclamation in relation to the stolen generations in Australia. Her family had made up an entire mission home. Devastating stories, but not just devastating, because also exquisite reclamations. Anyway, we've been doing that for a while, and we have a cup of tea. And then it was Jane who said to me, look, if I'm sharing my stories of my ancestors and I'm doing that with you, I think you need to be talking about your ancestors and connecting with your ancestors. And she went further, honouring your ancestors. And I was like, well, very different situation than yours, Jane. And what if my ancestors had done great harm to your people? And still over this cup of tea, she was like, well, some things very different, but some the same. You wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for them. Yeah. And I won't be able to trust you if you're not connected with and bringing your ancestors with you in this way. And that was a pretty significant invitation and challenge. I mean, it was about trust. This was about working together in the present, and what would make that possible. So yes, that posed, and also it was, these moments, Cathy, when someone just says something and it's not really an option. It's not really an option to this. And Jane said, if I'm sharing, she was going to give a keynote at an upcoming narrative therapy conference. That was what we were working towards. Yeah. And so Jane said, if I'm giving this keynote, I think you need to speak too. That was not the idea. I was the scribe here, Cathy. I was meant to be behind the scenes here. That was the plan. Yeah. But Jane said, no, that's what's going to need to happen. So, and I didn't know a huge amount about my ancestors' participation in colonial horrors in Australia. I knew enough to know they were there. Yeah. And I tried to then write something before that conference. I think I left a little bit late. That was a little bit foolish, but it was a bit of a challenge. So I had a draft. And the night before that conference, I read it out to Cheryl and to Michael White and to David Newman, who's a good friend of mine. And David Newman went, oh, it's lovely. It's great. It's good to have a friend like that. There's not that just whatever you do, they say it's really nice. Michael was just quiet and probably knowing that Cheryl would mention things. And Cheryl just said, look, it's sort of all correct. But if you think of how Jane's going to speak, and then you speak, it's not going to have the same resonances or and so it was Cheryl who suggested I write a letter to my great-great-grandfather. So, and he was a significant figure in colonial imposition. He was a premier, a first Chief Justice of Australia, very actively involved in multiple levels in dispossession of Aboriginal peoples, and other ancestors on my mum's side were also directly involved in frontier violence and killings. So it was the beginning of, giving you a rather long answer, but it was the beginning of a project that then took 20 years until that book was completed, which was a collective project. It wasn't just, couldn't just put this together, just me. It had to be with First Nations colleagues, so their voices appear all the way through it too. But it was a profound invitation from dear Jane, whom you know.
Well, I just wanted to say that form of, I don't know, gentle interrogation of ancestors, it's been a model for people over here. I've also referred to it and invited people to do similar things, whether it's actually writing a letter as part of their family history or just journaling or whatever, because it is important to acknowledge our ancestors, whatever they did. We're part of the line that kept, that's why we're here. That's why we've survived, right? Because of the things that they did along the way. And it's part of our philosophy that you have to acknowledge that. You can't just cut them off and pretend that they're not part of our lives, right?
I'd love to hear more about your thoughts about that. Particularly, one of the things that was most moving to me and unexpected is that after I wrote that piece, then speaking with First Nations colleagues who, like everyone, have multiple ancestries, multiple lines of ancestries, and then talking about and thinking about how does one relate to those multiple ancestries. It's such a complex realm, isn't it? I'd love to talk with you more about that, and different for all of us in our different social locations.
Yeah, I think one of the first pieces I had published in a Dulwich journal was something called Embodying the Oppressor and the Oppressed, my perspective as a Métis woman. And so I don't have ancestors that were in the English upper class, but I had ancestors that were in the fur trade, involved with the Hudson's Bay Company, and, did mid-level exploiting, I'm sure. But even when I was studying, I heard some, I guess maybe hardcore Indigenous theories that said you should just really identify with the Indigenous part of yourself. And I always thought, as a therapist, it doesn't really work to cut off part of who you are or leave it in some kind of shadow place, because it doesn't really promote our wholeness. So that was important to me too, just to look at, we're a bit of everything, right? We're a bit of social justice, and we're a bit of self-serving, feather nesting. So it was important, your book. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I remember that piece of yours. And also when I first came to learn more about Métis peoples and histories and creation, continual creation of identities, it's a very, that's a very significant, broader realm of learning for me too. We don't have a similar thing in Australia. But anyway, yeah, it's a realm of learning. I'd love to learn more from you about all of that.
Sure. And so now I'm going to take us to Oaxaca. Do you remember Oaxaca? So that's when I had my first taste of a insider witness group, I guess you could say. But just before I talk about that, yeah, I guess I'll just ask, what was it like for you to be doing all this work and all this writing and having all these conversations alongside Cheryl White and Michael White, and then seeing like Michael White become a bit of a therapeutic rock star and being very, known all around the Western world, really.
I just remember when I first came to Adelaide, I was so excited by the ideas and teamwork. That's what when I think of Michael and Cheryl and Dulwich Centre, and then Auntie Barb and all the people we've been mentioning. It was a place of both really exciting ideas, hard work. Michael just was worked really hard, really committed to the people he was meeting with, and being part of different teams, like those gatherings I mentioned earlier. It was on those gatherings. My role was often actually as a songwriter. So, Michael was leading the team. Cheryl was a key person in having the conversations about the teamwork. Anyway, it was just everyone just trying to think, what roles could we play to respond to, the local sufferings or whatever the invitations were at the time. And when I first visited Dulwich Centre to come and do an intensive, because I'd seen an advertisement in a Dulwich Centre newsletter while working in the prison, and I was staying at a youth hostel not far from Dulwich Centre, and the people were snoring in my room, so I couldn't really sleep. But I was so excited by the ideas that Michael was talking about in the intensive. It was great. I could just take all the notes. And then there were also these community projects that were happening. One was the one I talked about already, but another one was around the Alternative Community Mental Health Project. Determination to have a response to folks really struggling with mental health matters that was, outside the mainstream. Not going to be calling the police and it was a different sort of partnership and teamwork. So there was the therapy world, Michael's sparkling ideas, and so moving just watching the meetings with families, and then these community projects and teamwork. So they're the sorts of themes that emerge when I think about all of that. and um, and then when different people come and invite collaborations, um, thinking about it's not going to be able to be done the same way that it's done here, but how can collaborations take place to try and foster innovative approaches across cultures? Yeah, that's what all emerges from that.
Mhm.
I moved to Adelaide. I wasn't living here, so it became my home, and the Dulwich Centre community become my community of ideas. And yeah, it's been very, very special place and practice and politics for me.
Mhm. Yeah, so thank you for mentioning the guitar, the music, because you just reminded me of that, and that was such a fun part of the gatherings, and that process of being in circle or being in workshop with people who are, sharing their stories, their experience, their emotions, and then you could pick it up and put it into song, and you'd have a song ready, either, right there at the end of the workshop, either yourself or with, just riffing off all the people. But that was a really lovely part of the experience. Yeah.
Well, I know that's similarly with your work. It's not just in the spoken word, is it? All the different artistic realms and metaphors, and when we're working in this sort of space, it's cultural work too, isn't it? We need to be bringing everything from our respective cultures that can bring solace and sustenance and all these things that have forever been part of responding to suffering. Well, before there was a profession of psychology or a profession of mental health, people were turning to songs or tapestries or I just happen to be comfortable in the song realm, whereas I have absolutely no visual talent or no weaving or artistry talent. But yeah, just I once thought I had to either be a musician or social worker, as if they were separate entities. Well, luckily I realized that wasn't the case. I'm very interested in blurring those distinctions.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things that made the early conferences just so amazing and engaging and really fun. And just I remember meeting so many really wonderful people. It was nice to think of almost like a summer camp. I could go and see certain people year after year. And so I did go to Oaxaca, and there was a narrative conference there. And when I was there, my maternal grandmother passed away, and I just have a really sweet memory because I guess I told Cheryl, and she came and got me, and she said, "Oh, you have to have lunch with Michael." And so she sat me beside him at during the lunch, and he was just very sweet. And it was just after the time he'd written the book about grief called Saying Hello Again. And he just talked to me about my grandmother, and I could see some of the resonances of his writing there. And so I kind of got to experience that firsthand, what it was like to be asked those questions. And they were really beautiful questions. And then later on, you and your team, including like the Just Therapy folks, Charles Waldegrave and Kimi Tamasisi and Wahiri Campbell, just had a little circle and kind of like you shared really nice, just like thoughts and wishes, and hope that I would be well. And so I got to experience that kind of wraparound, really positive social response when a bunch of people share their caring thoughts about you, and it's very, very powerful. And you probably read it in my book. I kind of documented that because those kinds of experiences really can be life changing.
I remember that really, really well, and I appreciate you mentioning Tamale and Charles and the Justin Worry, the Just Therapy team, and how fond they were of you. And the other thing about that, I mean, that it was a beautiful, tender experience for all of us, like being able to sharing grief in honoring ways. It wasn't just for you, I mean, it was for you and your experience and your family, but actually it was, something that we all remember. I can remember that that setting, and it's to be able to share in other people's those key moments. They're transformative for all of us, aren't they? So I remember that so well, and I also remember, I guess it's about saying hello again, but I'm thinking about my dad and the conversations that you shared with him, and how they were also about broader social issues and social histories and the effects of uranium mining and nuclear testing. And this is a bit of a ramble now, but it's just made me think about, yes, how our lives and relationships have joined at particular times, and how much richer my life is for that. And I remember that time in Oaxaca. In that, I can't remember what the name of that hotel was. It was an extraordinary place, though, wasn't it?
It
Really
was. Yeah, your
Caminos.
parents. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Your parents would go to the conferences too, just to participate. Really sweet.
They really would. Yeah.
And I just remember, like, he was one of, I think, two physicians that I'd ever spoken with, because he was involved with Physicians Against Nuclear War, right? And he was the anti-nuclear party. So most doctors, they just say, you've got this cancer, or you got this illness, for either no reason, or we don't know why, or it's not related to the environment, bad luck, or whatever. But he and one other doctor that I met in Montreal later could really understand the connections between nuclear war, radiation, and the kind of harm that it does to the human body. And so for me, it was really validating when I was writing later in my book that I think that cancer is a political issue. And so few people talk about cancer as a political issue. It's just a health issue. But he really helped me, to frame my experience. But of course, he was just a lovely man in so many ways, and really, really fun, and that great spirit of activism. And
Well, I understood his work a bit differently because of your conversations with him, and you saying that too. So that was significant to me. And like here in South Australia, there were the nuclear tests that, for those of you who might be listening in a different part of the world, might not know, but the Australian government gave permission, or knowing the Australian government, they probably sort of asked for it, for the British government to then test nuclear weapons in a place called Maralinga, which is actually where Jane Lester's family is linked to. All these things are linked. And so there were these multiple nuclear tests in this part of the world that then spread radiation all over the state. And there are incredibly high rates of thyroid, not only cancer, but thyroid difficulties and not malfunctioning thyroids. Very, very, very high rates across South Australia, particularly for women. No link is drawn between these generally, but I don't think it's much of a coincidence. And yes, to make more of these links, and I really appreciate how you speak about the broader politics, the broader social context of cancer, and how we can not just silo physical experience from the political. I think your work around that is crucial.
Yeah, and so before we wind this up, I'm going to take us to one other place that I think was very, I don't know what the word is, like devastating, I'll say, for human beings on this planet. And I know that you and your team did a lot of really interesting work there, and that was in Rwanda. And I did go to one of your presentations when you talked about, working in community with some Rwandan people, and having them share their perspectives on how to live after that kind of experience. Would you like to just say a few words about what that meant to you to go do that work there?
Sure, it's a bit of a story too, Cathy, but we were actually, Michael, Cheryl, and I were all in Uganda trying to respond to things that were happening there. And there was just after we'd finished our time there, there was just a few days that we were going to have before we needed to go back to Australia. And Cheryl suggested, why don't we go to Rwanda to learn about how people were responding to the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis. So we went there. We didn't know anybody, but we went there to learn. And at that time, Kenya, Rwandan, and French were spoken much more than English. And we had to do a bit of a search to work out who could we learn from. We saw something on the television, and Kaboyi Benoit, who was the executive director of Ibuka, the Genocide Survivors Association, was speaking on the television. And so we worked out that this was the man to speak to. So we contacted him and interviewed him to learn about the work they were doing. And he was and still is, and we're still in touch, a very, very smart man. And at the end of the interview, he said, because he didn't know anything about, narrative therapy and community work, but at the end of the interview, he said, look, I feel a bit different because of this conversation that we've just had. Was that because of the sorts of questions that you were asking? And of course, this wasn't a therapy conversation, but the questions had been shaped in some ways by narrative practice. And I said, well, yeah, maybe that was the case. And so he then said, well, I'd like you to come back, your team to come back and work with our counsellors and assistant lawyers to try and find ways to sustain them in this work that they were doing. And so that we don't go places unless we're invited. We'd just be replicating colonial practice all over again. So this was Benoit's invitation, and it meant that we then needed to go back and wanted to go back, but it was a great challenge because we were very nervous about what on earth could we possibly have to offer. And as it turned out, it was Jill Friedman, Cheryl, and I who went back for the first training, and it ended up being very significant that Jill, as a Jewish practitioner, was there because the Rwandans really reached out to Jewish people, actually, through Jill, but to Jewish people, and they would ask questions that Jill couldn't possibly answer. And so Cheryl wrote out to all her Jewish colleagues in different parts of the world to write and respond back, and to Auntie Barb, First Nations colleagues. Anyway, it's a long story, but we learnt an extraordinary amount from that team. And last year we had a conference in Kigali, and there's a book of by Rwandans about their narrative practice, The Land of 1,000 Stories. That book is called, and there'll soon be a free African online web resource that'll feature some of the presentations from that conference. And it was a very significant place for us, Cathy. So I'm glad you asked, because during that first visit, Michael, Cheryl, and I sat at the top of the Hotel Miltaline, the quite famous hotel, Hotel Rwanda, as it's known. And we just realized, look, we have to take more action in the field of narrative therapy in order for the work to be relevant and resonant in contexts like this. If we're not doing that work, then what are we doing it for? And that's going to be a stretch. But it was where we then formed what became Dulwich Centre Foundation, and the sort of determination to join in partnership to diversify the approaches to respond to social suffering in different contexts. So yeah, there are many great Rwandan practitioners, one of whom is now in Canada, actually. Serge is living in Calgary. So if people want to make contact with him and learn more about Rwandan narrative practice. I'm sure Serge would be really happy to chat with you. And yeah, those collaborations continue. So yeah, thanks for asking about that. There's one other thing I'll say before we finish, Cathy, because you mentioned at the beginning about Oslo, and I hadn't thought about that for yonks. And yes, we met through family therapy.
That's right.
And we're just going to start a new project, making more links, family therapy, narrative therapy. I think it's going to be called Canadian family therapist Shannon came up with the title, Beyond the Borders or something. Anyway, and it'd be great to have you involved in that, Cathy, just trying to make more links between narrative therapy and family therapy fields, but also what does this look like in diverse contexts and social locations and outside conventional therapy rooms, and all your work will be very relevant to that. So as it develops, I'll let you know. Hope you can be involved.
Well, I'm a fan of family therapy, and I think it just fits with Indigenous communities well. It's about the clan, the relationships between people, analyzing power and safety. But just to go back a bit, you mentioned that this Rwandan fellow said to you there was something about the questions that you were asking that made me feel a little bit better. And so I'm just wondering, can you share like one or two of the kinds of questions or lines of questioning that took him to that place?
I'm not sure what it was in a particular conversation with Kaboy Benoit, although we published it, so I could look back, or I could send it to you. But I know that some of the ideas of narrative practice that Rwandan really took up in their own ways, and have shaped practices of remembrance, and the rituals that were held did include really thinking about what were the values, the skills, the stories of those who are no longer alive that have been carried forth, and how are the people in the present carrying those forth, and what would that mean for the collective of ancestors if they saw these very young, these young counsellors and assistant lawyers who are now responding to survivors across the country, what might that mean for them, and something about double stories, as you're more than aware of, the response-based sorts of consciousness about what sort of actions are these folks taking, and what are the histories of those, and linking those to across generations. They were some of the sorts of things that people embraced, but Serge would perhaps be better placed to tell you about that, and about the sort of letters that people have written to their beloved family members who so tragically lost their lives in those times. So yeah. I think you and Serge could probably have a great conversation about that. And we made a collective document in that first meeting. People spoke about, one thing that got them through difficult times in the present, one story about that, the history of that, and is it linked to any collective traditions? And we gathered up all the material from that. This was all in Kinya Rwandan. And then with a wonderful translator, Patrick Iragura, sat all night trying to work together to create a collective document in English. And then he would read it back in Kinya Rwandan as an oral ritual. So it wove together these stories of sustenance, these stories of how people were living in the shadow of genocide, and that sort of blend between personal and collective. And then this was written in a way that could be shared, so they were then making a contribution to others who are enduring great hardship. It's probably my favorite collective narrative principle, how we can enable contribution. So there were some of the sorts of things, but song was big in Rwanda too. And I'll just perhaps finish by saying one of the things I really learned from the Rwandans was we were so nervous in that first meeting. We're like, we're going to meet for a week trying to address problems of memory, which was the phrase that they used. And it was going to evoke so many different things. How are we going to keep people's spirits aloft during this week? Fortunately, we just asked them, and they said, oh, you know, we create a morale person. So we appoint someone and they will be morale for the week. And so I said, oh, okay, great. And how does that work? And they said, well, every so often we'll just, if anyone thinks it might be time for morale, we'll check in with each other. And there was this collective sort of whisper around the room, is it time for morale? And we might have just been talking about something really, really tender. And then it was like, yeah, I think it is. So this man who we recently met up with again, he would leap to his feet and get everybody up, and then there'd be song, or there'd be this joke or this dance. Then we'd sit back down again and we'd start talking about something incredibly touching and profound, but there'd always be this collective ethic of morale that would be negotiated and cared for. And that was another very funny thing, because they said we also need a discipline person. We're Australian. We're not much into having a discipline person. No, they said it's very, very important. This is a precious week. You know, if someone's on their phone too much, or there are these, coming in late, or we need a discipline person. We were like, okay. He said, do you have any idea who this could be? And they all went, yes, she's not here yet. And so then later on, we realized how this all planned out. They appointed this young woman who had a very, very strong relationship with her mobile phone, was often on her phone, and or would be late or talking to the person next to her. And of course, these are all survivors of terrible genocide, and were dealing with so much, and they all knew that. But they appointed her as the discipline person. So whenever there was a need for discipline, they go, is it time for discipline? Anytime she was doing this, they go, yes, discipline. And so then she would stand up and say, be quiet, everybody. It was such an exquisitely skillful, collective care process. Anyway, just two of the multiple things learned from Rwandan colleagues.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that. That's really beautiful, carrying forward the knowledge lines, writing letters to your beloved ancestors and family members, and these roles. So thanks. It's good to have a few concrete things to take away. And earlier you said, well, can I ask you some questions? It's not just like a one-way interview. And I said, that would be fine. So maybe to end, you could ask me a question.
Oh, I've got so many different questions, Cathy. I would like to ask you a bit about the response-based practice, but also how it fits culturally and spiritually. So something about how that dignifying work that you're involved with people in crisis, whether it's around issues of violence or other family sufferings, and something about the connection between the response-based dignity and culture. It's not really a very clear question,
Yeah.
but I'd be really interested in how you see those sorts of things coming together in your work.
Well, thank you. I'll try to give it a shortish answer. So like you, I'm part of a community of ideas over here. And so for at least 25 years, I've been working with people like Alan Wade and Linda Coates, and more recently, Shelley Dean. So people that were interested in social interaction in therapeutic ideas, but also a lot of those earlier experiments, in the 60s and 70s from the MRI, the Palo Alto, the Milan teamwork, which was so, in a way, inspiring, playful, sometimes edgy, and taking those ideas and really talking about them and exploring them and seeing like what were some of the threads, like I asked you about the Rwandan work, what were some of the threads that seemed to help people feel better in their lives, but also in their relationships with other people. And so also drawing from the work of writers who were political prisoners, including Indigenous people, um, how did they take care of their spirit? How did they manage when they were in prison camps that for children or in jail or in really adverse settings? And some of the teachings were about how to keep seeing yourself as a dignified person, how to resist the humiliation and the dehumanization that others wanted to put upon you, and then studying that, all the like beautiful things that people do in extreme situations. So there's lots of writing, like Irving Goffman wrote a lot about that, people in institutions, and James C. Scott, Domination and the Arts of Resistance. And then in my Indigenous teachings, I often talk about the Indigenous life cycle and the 6 directions. So, very briefly, when the little baby is preparing to come to be born here on this planet, it's like the a Northern Cree story is the creator drops the baby to the ground and the baby falls onto the land, and then a bear comes and bites the baby on the bottom, and that's why we have these Mongolian blue spots, they call them, from the bear bites. And at the right moment the baby jumps into the mother's body, in the teepee or in the tent, and is birthed. And when they arrive on this planet, they still have all this life force, and they're still in contact with the spirit world and creator and creation, and they're so full of life force. And so when you see these new babies, they just want to touch you and embrace everything. They're just so full of love and they want to join with everything. But then, as they journey through this medicine wheel, through the different life phases, they're often, experiencing hurts and disappointments in different ways. And it's like just popping their little bubble, and some of this beautiful life force comes out. So for the ones who've experienced more violence, degradation, humiliation, sometimes people look really dispirited. And
Mm.
I think our work is to help people get their spirits back, how to take that life force back. And in some ways, there's some parallel with shamanism, like somebody goes out and finds welcomes back the part of the spirit that they disconnected from because life was just too scary and you didn't want to take up too much space because you just get hurt. So through these stories and songs and rituals and practices, and we can rebuild ourselves, but it's very collective. And so what we have to do in community with each other is to engage with what we would call dignifying practices. So when I see someone and I let them know that I see them, and I see all the ways they've been trying to keep their spirit intact, keep their hope
Mm.
alive, keep connected with their family and their ancestors, how they've been resisting authorities, including child protection, social workers, and all these,
Mm.
structural impediments, and really just acknowledge that, and then play it back to them. Wow, I see you doing all these things, and we name them. It's very concrete. And then people can't go away with that idea of I didn't do anything. People feel that blame and shame because we live in a real victim blaming society typically. So when you just show people through your words and questions, everything they've already been doing, it is fortifying and restorative. And so people get some of that confidence and love, self-love and spirit back. And that's sort of how we see this healing process. And so people go through this wheel, different phases of life. And then when it's time for them, they exit out the wheel and go back to spirit. But this journey is just about really trying to reclaim who you are and what you came here to do. So I guess I'd say that, our main thing is just to find ways to treat people with dignity and to let them see their glorious selves, or even just how they manage really difficult situations. And then something really beautiful happens, right? And then, so part of the advocacy and social justice work is that we who have more social power need to keep contesting the dehumanizing practices in society. So I hope that's it in a, in a nutshell, but there's so much more to talk about.
I think that was incredibly beautiful. And I love your phrase, dignifying practices. But there was a whole sequence of questions you just asked there that when I listened back to this interview, I think they would be just, there was an exquisite sequence of questions that you just asked. And I hope we can make the time where I can use what you just said as a starting point for me to interview you. Should we make the time for that interview that we've had planned for rather a long time now? Life got in the family matters, and life got in the way at my end. That would be beautiful. The way you spoke about that, linking that to spirit and getting spirit back, how that's linked to the dignifying practices. I'd love to use that as a starting point to have a conversation with you, if that's okay.
Well, that sounds great. So I just want to thank you. Like I said, I've known you since 1999. We met in Oslo. It was one of my first international trips, at least with my young son, Rupert, who was probably like 6 months old. And I went there from Duncan, BC, to do a presentation on how I use narrative therapy in my work with Métis families. And so you came to talk to me, and that led to me coming to Australia. And also another friend, Robin Rutledge, he just came to see my talk because he couldn't believe there was someone else from Duncan there. So
that was I was pretty excited when I saw your name there in the program.
It was really just a really important moment for me in terms of my my career path, my work life, and the development of these ideas. So yes, let's talk again sometime. And just for everyone who has been listening, thank you so much. And all our relations, we'll put some links below so you can look up some of the work from Dulwich Center and some of the folks that David mentioned. And maybe there'll be a part 2 sometime. We'll see. So
wonderful. Yeah. Oh, can I interview you as on your own Substack? I saw someone else had done that. Can I do that?
Completely fine.
Okay. Wonderful. Let's do it.
Okay. So all our relations.